Everyone, again, welcome to our American Indian Heritage Month celebration. I'm pleased to have with me today Greg Richardson, the director of the North Carolina Indian Affairs Commission, and also Patrice Kunesh. She is our main speaker today, and Greg is also one of our speakers. I'm going to get started by doing a little housekeeping. And one that I was true to myself today, and that's keep your microphone muted. Please make sure that your microphone is muted if you're not speaking, so that everyone will be able to hear today's presentation. Today's presentation is also being recorded, so you can watch our presentation today a little after this afternoon. If you would like to, you can go to our website and get the presentation and share it with others. I'm going to start with our proclamation. Whereas North Carolina's American Indian Heritage Month is an opportunity to honor and celebrate the history and heritage of the American Indian people in our state who have lived in the geographic area of North Carolina for more than 12,000 years. And whereas today there are more than 122,000 North Americans who identify as American Indian, representing the largest American Indian population east of the Mississippi River and the 8th largest American Indian population in the United States. And whereas North Carolina is home to 8 state-recognized Indian tribes: the Kohari, the Eastern Band of the Cherokee, the Hawalapi Sapani, the Lumbee, the Meherrin, and the Onichi Band of the Sapani Nation, the Sapani and the Wak. And whereas our state is also home to 4 urban Indian organizations that hold membership on the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, the Cumberland County Association for Indian People, the Guilford Native American Association, the Metrolina Native American Association, and the Triangle Native American Society. Whereas American Indian tribes have a rich and ongoing history of government-to-government relations with the state of North Carolina, a mutual honoring that serves to protect the sovereign rights of our tribes and promote the advocacy of American Indian people. And whereas the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, the North Carolina Museum of History, and North Carolina's Indian tribes and urban Indian organizations have collaborated to develop the first virtual celebration of the American Indian Heritage Month in order to follow necessary safety precautions during COVID-19 pandemic. And whereas North Carolina's 2020 American Indian Heritage Month theme, Our Land, Our Stories, Our Survival, celebrates the preservation of American Indian customs and culture and advocates for the continued recognition of those integral facets of Indigenous history so that we may keep our memory alive. And whereas the state of North Carolina encourages people to learn more about the rich history of American Indian culture in our state and commit to preserve American Indian heritage and traditions for the generations to come. Now, therefore, I, Roy Cooper, Governor of the state of North Carolina, do hereby proclaim November 2020 as American Indian Heritage Month in North Carolina and commend its observance to all citizens. At this time, I will turn the program over to Greg Richardson. Greg, can you unmute your microphone, please?
Sorry about that, Wendy. So we're getting used to this new technology. I want to first of all thank OSHR. Thank you, Wendy, for putting together this program today and inviting Patrice Kunesh to be part of this program. She has quite a resume and quite a background in the area of Indian affairs, and I know that and those others who are participating in the program today will enjoy the message and the information that she's going to relay to you. I want to say also, Wendy, that we have Cheyenne Daniel with me. She's sitting here at my desk back here. She's a young intern working with us temporarily, just out of college, and she's the former Miss Indian North Carolina. So I invited her to sit in with us this morning so she can have the benefit of learning about what you all are doing this week as far as Indian Heritage Month. So to start with, I'm going to thank Patrice Kunesh for being with us again. Patrice is an attorney with an organization that we call NARF, Native American Rights Fund. And that is a nationally focused organization that provides a lot of good advocacy and work for us here in the United States. Patrice is of Standing Rock Lakota descent. She's a nationally recognized through leadership and advocacy, well known and for influencing, inspiring, and equipping cross-sector leaders to create inclusive economic systems and thriving societies, particularly within the Native American communities. She is the founder and director of Pehin Haha Consulting business, a social enterprise committed to building more engaged and powerful Native communities by extending assets, fostering social and human capital, strengthening capacity, and pursuing economic equity through research and advocacy. Her current engagement portfolio includes Prosperity Now, a CDFI and asset building organization, Enterprise Community Partners of Wells Fargo, which is a housing affordability breakthrough challenge entity, and she's affiliated with the National Congress of American Indians, working on building sustainable economies. She's done a handbook in that area. She's done some work with Johns Hopkins University Center for American Indian Health on COVID impact and food insecurity, and the Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group Rural and Regional Initiative. Patrice established and leads the Center for American Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, an economic policy research center dedicated to Indian country issues. She led numerous national and initiative publications on housing, education, financial institutions, etc. She also has held appointments as the Deputy Undersecretary of Rural Development at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as the Deputy Solicitor for Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of Interior. In addition, she served as an in-house counsel to the Mashantucket Pequot tribe on a variety of law issues and work. So give a round of applause, if you would, for our guest today, Patrice Kunesh. Thank you for being with us, and we'll hear from you now, Patrice. Thank you so much. Hello, Patrice. Can you hear me? You're still muted, Patrice. Still can't hear you, Patrice. Wendy, we still can't hear Patrice. I think we have a technical problem. Patrice, can you hear me?
Greg, I can hear you.
Okay, is there something that we can do on the technical side to get Patrice on the air?
Let me see. I'll talk to Wendy. I think Wendy's working on it. Give us a minute.
Yeah,
Hold on.
Wendy, I think Wendy can try to unmute everybody and then have everyone mute themselves. Don't know if that's a problem or not, but I don't think she's, I don't see her. And I just tried to text her, but that might work.
Patrice, can you hear me?
I can.
Hey, I heard you. There you are.
Okay,
I'm not muted, so
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the problem is.
That's happened to me before, Patrice, so it's not you. Okay, you can go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that. Well then, and Petuwaste Han Mitakuapi. I say good morning and greetings, all my relatives. It is a good day. And Wendy and Greg and Regina, thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you today as we celebrate, our rich history. Certainly 12,000 years, more than 12,000 years is an incredible heritage to celebrate. But we also want to talk about our enduring presence. And what I'd like to share with you today are some thoughts about an economic renaissance post-pandemic. So my talk today is about reimagining a native economic renaissance and its Indian country's pandemic recovery plan. And let's advance the slide and get right into it. So here's what I'd like to share with you today. Where is Indian country? And we just heard about the native indigenous communities in North Carolina. But let's take a broad view of where we're at as a nation. I thought I'd just have a brief overview of what laws define this place that we call Indian country. And then collectively, how can we reimagine a renaissance for Native American economies? And I'm sure in North Carolina, it's a big part of your consideration as well. And along the way, I'd love to have us think about, why does this matter? Why does this matter for me? Why does this matter for you? Why does this matter for North Carolina and certainly the entire nation? So let's go to the next slide. I thought if we're talking about our heritage, I would let you know my heritage. So I'm Hunkpapa Lakota on my mother's side, and going way back, we have Dahushta reindeer way back in the early 1800s who married Skuyapi. Skuyapi means to sweeten, and they had a child named Chunhapi, which means very sugary. So that's part of my heritage, and let's see what's next in the next slide. One of my relatives that I'm very, very proud of is Josephine Gates Kelly, Standing Rock Lakota Sioux. She was the first and only woman chief of the Standing Rock tribe. She was the tribal chair from 1948 to 1951. A beautiful woman, raised a very strong family, and endured tremendous hardships, including boarding school and extreme poverty. Next slide, please. I keep going here because there's a sort of an ascending. So this is my family. On the upper left would be my great-grandmother. With her children, they moved to St. Paul, Minnesota from the reservation due to poverty. They reestablished community connections there. upper right would be my mother and her cousins. And, you know, this is a really interesting photograph, because my mother did not grow up on the reservation while her cousins did. And we have a very, very different life view. On the left, family. I come from a family of 13 brothers and sisters, and we're all over the place. One in Tennessee and works with the Indian Affairs down there. A sister who's now become a state senator in Minnesota, the first Native woman senator, and just an incredible array of interests and work throughout Indian country. And on the bottom left are my nieces and nephews from Oglala Pine Ridge to the Fort Berthold tribe to the Standing Rock tribe. So we have generations that celebrate and live our Native heritage every single day. Next slide, please. And you know, where it comes from, Standing Rock, it's not just a place on the map. It's a place in my heart, and it has not just history and heritage. It has vibrancy. It really drives me to continue this work and to work as hard as I possibly can, not just for our Standing Rock people, but for all of our people. Next slide, please. Okay, let's take a look at Indian country. Indian country is really a legal term. Greg mentioned that I'm a lawyer, and one of the first things we learn about are the statutory definitions. And so when we say we're Indian, or we're Native, or we're Native American heritage, we sort of wonder, where does that come from? And we also heard from the proclamation that the government has the federal government, the state government has a government-to-government relationship with tribes. These terms are all defined by law and by judicial decree. So Indian country is actually a term defined in federal criminal statutes, and it really defines lands within reservations, areas we call dependent Indian communities that we think of, for example, as Oklahoma, perhaps Alaska as well. And then subdivisions and parcels called allotments. My family has a sizable allotment on Standing Rock Reservation. And so these define territories over which tribes exercise their jurisdiction, their authority over people, over activities. Next slide, please. So as a term, we have Native American, American Indian, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiian, state recognized, federally recognized. All of these terms, you know, are out there to say who we are, to describe, to define who we are. Who we are really is you know, a personal issue. And then it's also very much tribe dependent. From a U.S. Census perspective, and we've just gone through the decennial census for 2020, we're defined as American Indian and Alaska Native, or AIAN. In the United States, we have 574 federally recognized American Indian tribes. And included in that number is 229 Alaskan Native communities. So quite large, quite expansive. We also heard we have very large, expansive urban populations, pan-Indian communities where we have melting pots of many of Native people from many different tribes. Native Hawaiians, of course, not federally recognized, but we include them and embrace them into our fold. And then we have dozens and dozens of state recognized tribes. And in North Carolina, you have 12, and I'm sorry, 8 state recognized tribes. All of us are related. All of us come from very much a same colonial background. And our survival, our resiliency is part of our collective lived experience. Next slide, please. So this is the map of Indian country, and you can see this is by the U.S. Census. It's old because it does not include the newly recognized federal tribes, but it gives you a pretty big picture of what Indian country looks like. And on the East Coast, we have much smaller tribes, a lot of state recognized tribes, and there's a whole history there. But you can see Oklahoma in sort of those bluish boundaries. Those are the quote unquote dependent Indian communities that I was referring to earlier. Although the U.S. Supreme Court just this past year recognized in the McGirt case that there still is definite Indian lands, the Choctaw Nation. My tribal land is in the Dakotas. You can see Standing Rock that straddles both North and South Dakota. It's a very large land base. And then, of course, Navajo, which is the largest land base of all the tribes throughout the country. And they've been hit terribly, terribly hard through the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at the demographics. I showed you the land, talked about what defines Indian country. The American Indian Alaska Native population, from a federal perspective, is 5.2 million strong. And I have to share with you that we are the fastest growing population in the country. Now, the U.S. Census breaks us down between American Indian alone, without any other race or ethnicity, and then in combination with other ethnicities. So we're about 3 million American Indian Alaska Natives alone. And then the larger segment of our population is in combination, and that could be Hispanic, it could be other race and ethnicities. So we need to take a look at where we are, who we are, and to address the sort of the social economic needs of this growing population. About 60% of American Indians, Alaska Natives, live on or near the reservation. So there's a very strong geographical tie, cultural tie to the reservations, to our homelands. And then the combination, the AIAN population, in combination with other race and ethnicities, is really trending to metropolitan areas, that pan-Indian melting pot in the urban areas. As an age group, American Indian, Alaska Natives are very young. We're about a third of us are less than 18 years of age, compared to only about 0.25% nationally. Median age is about 26 years, so we are thriving. We have a lot to offer and a lot of energy and talent to add to our Native communities. Next slide, please. So federal policies, and I know we're talking a lot about federal law. It's I think the predominant law that sort of sets the tone and structure. And we definitely can talk about state policies as well. But you probably know quite a lot about the treaties between the federal government and tribes. And these treaties really were originally treaties for peace. And as the European colonists arrived on our shores, they really wanted to have trade and commerce with Native people. So these treaties were about peaceful relationships between leaders and to develop trade and commerce. American Indians were incredibly knowledgeable, of course, about the resources, and not soon after the arrival, of course, those resources were exploited. And those and the best resource that we have are lands that we occupy, right? So the treaties then morphed from treaties of peace and protection for land cessions. And when you think back about that big map and you see how the Western tribes have still maintained very large land bases intact, and on the eastern coast we see very few, large land base. It's because of these treaties that ceded so much of the land. And it was either land cessions or war, and Native people chose peace. They chose survival. Along the way, though, the federal government wanted to force Native people to become acculturated into the dominant European society. And through courses of assimilation, like boarding schools, they attempted to beat out and train Native people not to be Native people. They tried to erase their total identity. So assimilation was one of these large, broad, expansive federal policies now to eradicate nativeness. And of course, jurisdiction. When I talked about Indian country earlier, those statutes defined authority over land and people and activities. And so we see a lot of federal statutes that try to restrict Native government authority and impose pervasive state authority or federal authority on these lands. So these are sort of the host of federal policies that have tried to restrain and restrict and essentially diminish Native people. Next slide, please. And all of this has wrought historical trauma through the eradication of language and culture and religious practices by opening up reservations to non-Indian settlement, by taking away our Native authority. They tried to erase our identity. This is a picture from the Carlisle Indian boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. My great uncle and my great aunt attended school here. My great aunt was Josephine Gates Kelly, who I mentioned earlier, who became the first and only woman chief of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. Thousands upon thousands of Native children were removed from their families, sent thousands of miles away. And as you can see, their hair was cut. They had to wear Western clothes. They were forbidden, beaten, if they spoke their native language. So advance the slide 2 times. I was in Washington, D.C. for several years. And before I left Washington, D.C., I went to Carlisle. I really needed to see where this part of my family heritage. And there's nothing left of the Indian schools. It's become a military training post. But what does remain are the cemetery. And here we have hundreds of markers of children who died at Carlisle. On the right, we see so many graves of these children who died unknown. Probably their families never knew what happened to them. And then on the left, we see Fanny Charging's shield with this generic marker Sioux, without really knowing who she was. And she died in March of 1892. It's just absolutely tragic. One of the comforting things is that people still remember, and you can see the medicine wheel on Fanny's grave and the flower on the unknown grave. This is the heritage. This is the historical trauma, I think, that has carried on with our families and has really challenged us in terms of our resiliency. Next slide, please. So what does this historical trauma look like, physically? Our American Indian and Alaskan Native health is very precarious. We are quite a vulnerable population, and we see this really exposed and revealed through the pandemic. These disparities equate to inequities that are making us sick and has exacerbated the impacts of COVID. And you take a look along the line of suicide and diabetes and heart disease and cancer and substance abuse. All of these have added up over time and spilled over into how we live our lives and how we see opportunities going forward. And here we have a Native person telling us that our bodies just don't tell us stories. They tell our histories. So think about what your family history is, and if any of these things are part of your life. And this then becomes part of our epigenetics. It becomes into our DNA. And we know from brain science that that to really address our resiliency, we need to address these health disparities. So healthy children equate to healthy nations. And we need to look at our health systems, our food systems. We need to look at taking care of ourselves so that this historical trauma link is broken and we can really foresee a strong, healthy, vibrant life ahead. Here's a slide. One of the biggest issues that we've seen in the last few years, in a good way, is attention to missing, murdered Indigenous women. My sister, who recently won a Senate position in the state of Minnesota, is a representative right now. And she was able to get 100% bipartisan support in the state legislature to create a task force to study missing, murdered Indigenous women throughout Minnesota. It's not just defined to Minnesota. It's very much a part of the Dakotas, Canada. It's an international issue. It's a national issue where hundreds of our Native women who've been abused or assaulted have gone missing. And no one knows where they went, what happened to them. Sometimes we might find that they've been murdered, but we don't know the circumstances around the murder. We don't know the circumstances of how they went missing. And we see this in our aunties, we see this in our grandmothers, we've seen this in our sisters and our daughters. And I don't know any family that has not been touched by a Native woman who's not been sexually assaulted, who's not been hurt and predated on in her lifetime. And these are national numbers in one way or another. And I think it's really, really important that we take a look at the systems that allow our Native women to be so phenomenally targeted for violence. Next slide, please. And when we look at the number, it's just absolutely atrocious. Native women are twice as likely to be sexually assaulted as women of other ethnicities. And a lot of this might be due to intimate partner violence. It may be due to the vulnerability of Native women to be kidnapped and then into harm's way. They're more likely to be assaulted by non-natives. And we've seen a lot of evidence of this around, we call them man camps, the man camps of mining, mineral extraction, sex trafficking, and so forth. In the background of this is we find poverty, the substance abuse, this historical trauma coming to the front. And so that makes Native women much, much more vulnerable to exploitation. So we need to put together systems of protection, systems of awareness, and opportunities for healing and creating safe places for Native women and children. Next slide, please. And when I think about building protective systems, I think about it also in terms of social services and economic terms. So let's take a look at the economies of Indian country. We have two very different stories. We have this fragility and vulnerability over here. And on the other side, we have strength and resiliency. In the last 3 decades, Native tribes have really begun to lift up their economies. And a lot of that has been due to Indian gaming revenue. In North Carolina, the Eastern Cherokees have been a great contributor, not just to the economy and local regional economy, but have really lifted up as an example of successful economic development that then translates into community development. So starting in 1985, we can see that gaming revenue obviously was zero, but it soared high in the 1990s and the 2000s, and now we're about $37 billion industry. We don't have 2020 on the end of it, but you would see that it was a sharp plummet, an enormous decline, obviously because casinos were shut down with the pandemic. Next slide, please. Now, when we think of the revenue, how does that translate into supporting the community, supporting the individual? And one thing to note is that Native American per capita income has risen 48% in the last 30 years. Now, that's a big percentile, right? But we're starting at very, very low numbers. If you look at the 1990 tranche, it's less than $10,000. And now we've gained, we're up to $14,000. That $5,000 spread is pretty significant. It's not anywhere near the national or state level of per capita income, but it represents to me the great opportunity ahead of us of lifting ourselves through self-governance, through self-determination, a very strong individual growth. So let's take another look. Next slide, please. And when we compare ourselves, in terms of economic growth and development, we're still far behind, but we see this enormous potential of American Indians on reservations versus all other. And this is where we need to focus. This is our opportunity. Next slide, please. Now, as we said, per capita income, household income has risen greatly through the support of gaming and gaming-related businesses. How has that translated into the individual? Well, this slide tells us, when there's a per capita or distribution of income to the individual, we see some really phenomenal benefits on children and families. And by the way, this data comes from a study of the Eastern Band of Cherokee, North Carolina. So we see graduation rates increasing, strong education development, almost 40% increase in terms of high school graduation rates. We've increased the years of education. We're staying in school longer. Arrest rates have gone down with income stability, people feeling less need to act out. Civic engagement has been up. People want to feel engaged and part of their community, so they're going to the voting booth and they're participating in local politics, running for offices and representing school boards and county commissioners. Parental stress has reduced as well. So we see less stress, less fighting, within the family. And that also leads to lower drug and alcohol abuse. Employment opportunities have stayed steady, and we have found that in terms of health, people have reduced smoking, they've reduced their drinking. actually started on a very healthy trajectory. So this is what a universal basic income can do to individuals and families: improve all around educational outcomes, improve health outcomes, and really support the family in being more cohesive and harmonious. Next slide, please. One of the things that I took a look at is, where are the jobs on reservations? When we think about economic stability and then the opportunity for growth, we need to look at, okay, where are these jobs? And I showed you the slide where the casino income has been on this amazing upward trajectory. Most of these jobs are in the gaming entertainment area. No surprise, right? They also are concentrated in the public service sector. Governments, tribal government related businesses. And then we see lower participation in, for example, agriculture or construction, retail, businesses that might be located on reservations. What this slide tells me, though, is that we're vulnerable as an Indian country in our over-reliance on jobs in these two sectors, gaming and related businesses, and the public sector. And what we've seen illuminated through the pandemic is that when you have to shut down your only source of income, you shut down the entire economy, it exposes us to real vulnerability. So my renaissance for Indian country is about diversification. We need to balance out education, training, and jobs across the spectrum in other areas. Please advance the slide. I also think that as we look forward to an economic renaissance, we need to make sure that everyone is included in this rebuilding. And when I think about not just the social inclusion and economic inclusion, we need to make sure that our elders are included in this and our children. The biggest investment we can make with the best return on investment is early childhood development. Early childhood development means stimulating the brain, making sure children are emotionally strong and healthy. They're ready to go to school and to really learn. We know that birth through 3 is one of the most critical times. And then, of course, the next 3 years, through 5 and 6 years old. These are the most critical times to invest in our children. And that's language, that's culture, that's ceremony, that's our rich, rich heritage. The return on investment in our children is 1 to 17. So for every dollar you invest in children, you get a $17 return. And that's the slide I was showing you about healthy outcomes, about higher educational attainment, and about being more harmonious and engaged economically and civically. So my renaissance for Indian country is diversification with a focus on social inclusion, investments in our children. I think I'll stop there. I could share a few more thoughts and ideas. But how about hearing from some of you? Do you have questions or stories from your own experiences that you can share?
At this time, I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions right now as we transition into the next part of our program. You can submit your questions to the chat, and I'm going to ask Greg to bring his camera up as well so that we can get started with the next section. But we are going to continue and have this and answer questions that we have right now. And as we transition, I'm going to also bring up a presentation for Greg. But before we do that, we're going to start a conversation between the two of you, Greg and Patrice.
Okay. Thank you, Patrice, for that very enlightening message and information that you've presented. A lot of history there and a lot of reflection in terms of, the economic status in our country now across the United States. And I was paying attention to the last comments you were making about education. And education, of course, is very, very important in our country. And, I'm very impressed that I'm seeing where you have gaming tribes now that they're investing heavily in the education of their children. You mentioned reference to Eastern Band of Cherokee and the work they've done here in our state in relation to Indian education. Not too long ago, they had just a few traditional speakers. So the language was basically about to be going by the wayside, but they built into their system now where they're actually teaching at the Kadua school up there, and all of the young students in that school has to speak Cherokee language. So that's true sustainability. And I know in the country we have a lot of dialogue and discussions about gaming, whether it's good for the community, whether it's not. And I think it's all about and you might have some comments on that. It's all about how the tribe, designs a plan for their gaming proceeds. A lot of tribes have per cap payments that there's a per cap type of payment that's paid out to each tribal member at certain times of the year. And that revenue is based on the income of the casinos. So when the income of the casino drops down, then that percentage drops down. But what I wanted to say about Eastern Band is they have a very good system there in that they do not hand out all of their proceeds in per cap payments. If my memory is correct, I think they can only place about 50% of their proceeds back out into the community. The remainder of that money has to go into school, education, schools, and those kind of things. So Patrice, you might share with us some thoughts about that particular concept in terms of tribal sovereignty and tribes being able to make those kind of sound decisions and decisions that make sure that revenue is flowing not only just back into the hands of the tribal members, but going back into infrastructure, going back into education.
Right. And Greg, you've hit it right on the head. As any government is challenged, you have to invest in your communities, you have to invest in your people. Infrastructure, we need schools, we need roads, we need bridges, we need so many things that support the wholeness of our community. And the community is as good as people, right? We might be able to drive on bumpy roads, but we really want people to know how to drive. And we know that teaching people skills, young people skills, will last a lifetime. So one of the questions that came through was, how do we connect the education, and it should be a lifelong education, into life skills, into a sense of economic opportunity, not just for oneself, but for growing the community. And when we think about any government, if it's a state, county, tribal, federal government, trained, skilled workers are the essential ingredients to making thriving economies. So why wouldn't we insist that children have a strong early childhood development opportunity? and that all of our children graduate from high school, and that we create opportunities for advanced education and training. And, you know, from an HR perspective was another one of these questions is, it's not just finding the right people to bring into that particular job, it's creating a pipeline so that not only do we have people who are ready to slide in and do the work now, but we're developing a very trained professional workforce for the future. So when we think about the youth, the youth of Indian country, this youth is captive as far as training and development. So as you think about what jobs are needed, you know, do we need doctors? Do we need nurses? Do we need IT people? We should be planning our training and opportunities around the jobs of the future. And when we think about how do we recruit, I was the director of a Native American Institute at the University of South Dakota. And I would go to the reservations and I would go to the families. And these are communities that never had a thought that their child would go to school. And so it's a personal connection. You are able to go to school. You are invited to this community. I knew a young man who lived on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and he would do his homework at night with a lamp that was connected to 2 extension cords. And the original power outlet was in his aunt's house, like 60 feet away. They did not have running water. They had a hose. But this young man earned a full scholarship through the Gates Foundation, a Gates Millennial Scholarship, because he had a family that supported him and institutions that supported him. A phenomenal young man. So I just can't say enough of how important it is to support education in a broad array, from birth, you know, to our age.
And Patrice, you know, it's another topic that a lot of people is interested in right now is, of course, the election. And we just, you know, completed the national election, and you know that we have some American Indian women that are now in Congress. And just wanted to maybe have you to share your thoughts about that. To my understanding, we have 2 more maybe now that I don't know if all the totals are in yet, but we might even have 4 American Indian women who've been elected to the U.S. Congress, either the House or Senate. I don't know all those dynamics. But would you care to maybe comment on some of that, and also the importance of that? Because there was a point in history when, number one, we couldn't even vote. We could not vote.
Oh my gosh, Greg.
There was a point in history when we didn't have anyone in Congress to speak for us. Right. So would you just comment on the importance?
Oh my gosh, this is this is a topic that gets me going. So you can cut me off. But, you know, one of the benefits I told you that is derived from basic income support is more civic engagement. And how do people, you know, what triggers people? What motivates people to become civically engaged? It's that sense of hope and opportunity and a sense of confidence, right? That I can do this. Now, for so many years, we've been told you can't do this, won't do this, and we're going to prevent you from doing this. And it's just absolutely horrifying when I think of when my grandfather was born on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota in 1903. He was not, or his family were not considered a citizen of the United States. And they could not vote. They were considered too savage, too heathen, and actually too poor to vote. It wasn't until 1924, through the Indian Citizenship Act, that Native people were recognized as citizens. but they still couldn't vote until 1964 through the Voting Rights Act. And that's when I think true democracy came, when everyone is able to participate in the electoral system. That is true democracy. And what we saw this year was the impact of Native voters across the country. So Greg mentioned the additional number of Native peoples now elected to Congress. We wouldn't even think of that possibility, a couple decades ago. Native people carried the vote in Arizona. 96% of the Navajo reservation voter, first of all, I had phenomenal turnout. And of those voters who turned out, 96% voted for Joe Biden. Now, whatever your political persuasion is, it shows you the impact of the Native vote. The Native vote was responsible for carrying the election in Wisconsin, in Nevada. And as we see more and more participation, both in terms of voting, but also being represented, we want to see people who look like us, who know our lived experiences. We are going to be seeing ourselves really lifted up on a national stage. One of the things I hadn't mentioned is that in the demographics, in the economic studies, we often don't see Native Americans, American Indians at all represented. We have to really dig deep. It often becomes that asterisk at the end of the report, and we're considered that other category. Well, I coined this term, asterisk nation, because we were invisible or set aside. But you might remember, if you were watching CNN on the election night, as they were looking at categories of voters, of course, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and then they had this something else category. Do you remember that? It was something else. And that's where the Native American people were, in this something else category. And I'll tell you what, this something else category really came out strong, really made a difference in many states. And it's a sense of enthusiasm, of engagement, and of pride. We've got confidence. We can do this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That civic engagement is very important, Patrice, as you mentioned. And, I think there's a history that's tying into the historic trauma that you talked about. For a long time, American Indians did not feel comfortable engaging in the political process, registering to vote, or running for a public office, because there was this force out there that wanted to prevent them from being, as we call it in this part of the country, at the table. It's good to see that things are changing and that we are now at the big table at Congress. So I'm hopeful that we will see a lot more change taking place in the country in terms of the needs of American Indians. I know we're getting a little bit short on time, Wendy, and I can't see whether you have questions in the chat or not, Wendy, but I guess at this point I will yield and let you be thinking about that. But as we get to that, Patrice, I just have to ask you for some comments on the two American Indian communities that we have in the United States. We have the federally recognized Indian communities that you talked about. We have the off-reservation Indian communities, which we've also mentioned today. But we don't often hear a lot about the off-reservation Indians. And I'll give one quick example of what we started out with here in North Carolina. When COVID hit us, we were not able to get data on the number of American Indians that are impacted with COVID-19. So since March, we've been working with our North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. So now and today, we can get data down to the zip code link in our communities, right down to the zip code. We can determine how many American Indians in my Halawassaponi community have been impacted with COVID. But we still cannot get that by tribe. So we still have a way to go, but we're getting there. So I thought you might have some comments about how we are impacted with data. It's just like if you're not counted, you're not visible, then you can't, tribes do not have that data to use and go after grants, justify funding. So it's very important for us to be counted. We're not an other. We are our people here in the United States. So I thought you might want to comment about that.
Oh, Greg, that you said it beautifully. We have to be counted. We have to be considered. We have to be at this big table, as you say, to really make sure that the resources are allocated in a fair and equitable way. You know, from the tribe's perspective, they would say we've been counted many, many times, and the data being used have been used against us. When we think about the missing, murdered Indigenous women, or we think about the boarding school, or what have you, a lot of the data has been used against us. My recommendation to tribes along the way have been control your own numbers, understand your own communities. And every community that I go into, every tribal leader, I ask, what are your numbers? How many youth do you have? How many elders do you have? What is your employment numbers? You know, how many are unemployed? The tribal leaders should know the demographics and the dynamics of their community and not wait for somebody to say, this is what you look like. This is how you are composed, and this is what you are comprised. Because if tribal leaders know their communities and know their community needs, they are the best advocates for their communities. And the Harvard Project on American Indian economic development has looked at this front to back, sideways and forward, and they have found the one thing that is consistently true in terms of success, in terms of progress, in terms of development, is self-governance. When tribal nations are self-governed, they do much, much, much better than when they are dependent on state and federal support. So our numbers might be invisible to the outside. So we need to know who we are and what we look like from the inside.
Thank you, Patrice. And I guess now we'll jump over to Wendy and see if we have questions.
All right, Greg. I wanted to, before we get started with your part of the presentation, Greg, I wanted to let you know that we do have a question, and it's a timely one because we have in attendance a lot of our EEO officers and some recruiters as well. And our EEO officers, of course, look over the positions and the classifications that we have open within our agencies and universities, and they look at the demographics of these positions that we have across the state and how they can recruit and retain employees. And I have a question from someone that says, can you give us some ideas on where HR professionals can concentrate on recruiting Native American, American Indian candidates for state jobs? And I wanted to start with you, Greg, because of your North Carolina affiliation, but Patrice, feel free to chime in on that because they're just looking at what they can do as recruiters to go out and seek employees that are of American Indian background.
Okay, well, I guess first of all, I would say utilize the resources of our Indian Commission here. We have a workforce development, very large workforce development program. Candace Lowry is our director of that program, and the whole charge for that particular component of our operation is to help our folks get jobs, get them trained for jobs, get them into a community college setting where they can get some skills, encourage them to go on then beyond community college to a four-year school. So that's one resource. The other one, as far as recruitment, would be to work with us when we have our Indian Unity Conference in March of every year. And there's an opportunity there to have a booth, to have some people from various EEO offices or OSHR. And I think you all have said it there before in terms of getting the message out about how to apply for state jobs and what positions are available, how to get to that website so you can see those job openings and those kind of things. And then the universities that we have in North Carolina that are American Indian serving. I use that term because we have certain universities that the majority of our Indian people who attend college would go to. That would be the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, because it started out as Pembroke Indian Normal School many years ago, but now is part of the university system. And then UNC Chapel Hill, NC State, and UNC Wilmington. I think those universities you're going to find the great majority of our students going. East Carolina is a good problem as well. You'll find most of our students are actually going to those universities. So there again, going directly to the universities. And then there's just a multitude of cultural events, powwows, celebrations throughout the year. And our website has a list of all of those. Of course, COVID-19 now has knocked all that out. Everything has had to go virtual since then. In addition to that, our Indian Unity Conference, which is going to be hosted this weekend, normally a huge celebration, downtown Raleigh, with 8 to 10,000 people showing up. Well, this year, they're not going to be there because everything is going to be virtual because of COVID-19. So that's just a snapshot of some areas that we can look at as far as recruitment and those kind of things. So, Patrice, you have some thoughts on that as well?
Oh, absolutely. You know, many universities, and I think there are a couple programs in North Carolina that have a Native American group, a Native American major. And these are opportunities to really get to know the students and see what their talents are and to develop a rapport with them. We have many tribal colleges and universities that are developing some very strong, talented Native youth. So absolutely work through Native colleges, tribal colleges and universities. A wonderful program is the American Indian College Fund, and they will have a landscape of students from around the country. There are many, many ways, in addition to what Greg was saying, statewide, to look sort of at a broader array of opportunities to recruit Native people. You know, and you might say, well, what does somebody from Oklahoma want to do in North Carolina? It goes back to the opportunity to create a really robust and diverse workforce. And as I mentioned earlier, diversity, not just in terms of jobs, but diversity in terms of lived life experiences really enriches all of us. And I think that understanding the native culture is as important to including, of course, Native people into the workforce, but into the community as well. You know, it's not just our heritage. You know, it's who we are, as I said, as our identity that brings so much to the conversation. The first Native American woman to argue in the Supreme Court was a Lumbee woman, Arlinda Locklear. And I think back on Arlinda as she might have not had the opportunity to go to school, either high school or college or law school. So it's also about not just recruiting them and hiring them, but creating these opportunities for the individuals to have an education in one form, shape, or another. Greg, you're on mute.
Thank you, Patrice. Arlinda Locklear is certainly a role model for not only North Carolina Indians, but every American Indian in the United States, certainly American Indian women. So she's certainly well thought of here. I have a high degree of respect for her. So I guess we're ready for another question, or I think we're just about, Patrice, into the wrap-up phase. Are there, while Wendy's getting ready for that, do you have any maybe closing comments?
There was one thought. You know, when we think about Native women, and I'm going to make a pitch here for Native women. Not only, you know, have we, you know, looked at the scope of the missing, murdered Indigenous women, but women are really the backbone of our families. In my family, we're very matriarchal, but we're leaders. You know, we're leaders of our families, we're leaders of our community, we're leaders of our nations. And as I think about the future of Indian country, of our communities, and of our nation, I am so very, very grateful to Native women, to their strength, their perseverance, their resiliency. And not just from an economic perspective and a social perspective, which both show that, you know, that when Native women succeed, the whole community succeed beyond, you know, expectation. I think I just really appreciate the lineage, my lineage, which comes from my mother's side. And I am so proud to be part of this extraordinary, you know, heritage.
Very well put. Yes, American Indian women, you know, Wilma Mankiller. We have our first woman chief, Chief Richardson, the Halawasa Pony. So women are making their way to the forefront and making some very important differences in our country. So, you know, we're going to continue supporting our women. You mentioned the issue with the missing and murdered women. Still a ways to go as far as some changes in regulations and rules that impact that. You know, it's been for many years sad that, you know, non-Indians could go onto reservations and commit a crime, and then the tribal court couldn't reach to them. You know, that's impropriety that has changed somewhat, but does still need some other work. As I mentioned to you earlier when we were getting ready for this presentation, I'm very concerned about Indian child welfare. That's a topic we could spend another hour talking about for sure, but very committed to trying to bring about some change there. We brought about some change here in North Carolina, but there's still not a nexus between at all, no nexus at all between the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act, which is federal legislation, and state legislation that deals with the placement of children into foster care and then permanently into adoptive care. So what happens with the current rule, a lot of our American Indian children are placed outside of the communities, still fall in that line of the Indian boarding schools, placing the child away from their family into an unknown community, and then after they grow up, they have no knowledge of their heritage very much or their community. So there's that disconnect that we still need to bring up. So there's a lot to do, and we're going to continue doing that. And Patrice, I look forward to maybe some opportunity later to work with you on another project. So I'll turn it back over to Wendy now. I think we're getting pretty close to wrap up. Wendy.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Greg, did you want to go through some of your slides, or?
I can, but if you have other questions, I'm one that would rather get the audience and your employees involved. I think that's more important than my presentation.
Okay.
Although
all right. Well, I have put out. I'm making another request again to the chat room if we have any other questions at this time. I did want to know if you could tell us a little more about some of the some of the tribes, the 8 tribes that we have here in North Carolina?
Sure. I'll start with the Commission of Indian Affairs legislation. The North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs was established in 1972, following the 60s civil rights era, when people were given more of an opportunity to have a voice, and in our case, have a voice in state government. So our tribal leaders came to North Carolina General Assembly and met with legislators, and were able to get legislation in place to create the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs. And so the authors of that legislation, working with tribal leaders, made some very interesting and important decisions about that, because the tribes in our state, the tribes select their own representatives to the Commission of Indian Affairs. And so we have 8 tribes in North Carolina, and they all select their individuals through their own procedures that they've developed to get their representatives on the commission. Some of them they're appointed by the tribal council in some cases. Some are appointed by the tribal chair or tribal chief, and then some are elected. Total election is held in the community to get the representative on the commission. So once they're on the commission, they serve for 3-year terms. And then another I thought was unique in terms of our legislation, we have non-Indians also on our commission, as the statute indicates. Therefore, we have 5 state officials. We have the secretary of this department, North Carolina Department of Administration, Department of Quality, and on and on and on. So we have state officials on our commission that can help us with decisions, help us with funding for projects and those kind of things. One of the things we have going on tomorrow is a presentation regarding impairment. That's a real critical discussion going on in many circles around the country, but we're hoping that we can do something in North Carolina so that when we have natural disasters, these floods that come through, that immediately, and we've been able to get some of that in place immediately, the tribes, through the emergency services connections, tribes are contacted and treated in the same like manner as cities, as counties. Because we have most of our communities in rural areas, and so when the flooding came through in the last couple of years, we had some devastating situations in our communities here, and there's no reason for any community to be left out of the process when people are hurting, people are dying, and need services. So we're working on some of that. The commission is authorized by legislation to administer certain programs. And so I mentioned already the Workforce Development Program. Our newest program is going to be our Domestic Violence, Patrice, and Sexual Assault Program. That's our newest funding, and the whole goal of that is to address that issue that you talked about. Here in North Carolina, we have missing and murdered American Indian women who are state recognized. We have issues here where there are cases unsolved, where we had a young Hallowasaponi student at University of North Carolina that was going to be a pediatrician, very bright, Faith Hedgepeth, was killed right outside of campus. That case has never been resolved. We have a young Locklear girl when I came on board in 1995, waiting for a school bus. She was taken and she was killed. They found her weeks later in a road ditch culvert. That case has never been solved. We have, in recent years, a young lady in Lumbee who worked at Walmart just outside of Pembroke. She left to go to work one day. Her car was found in a cornfield or a field there in the community. That case still not resolved. And so we have missing and murdered American Indian women in these areas. Sometimes I think that American Indian women are somehow targeted. There is this opinion or feeling out there in some cases that we as American Indians get free funding for this, money for that, and somehow there could be a benefit by, stealing one of our American Indian women and getting some funds. We don't know that to be true, but we believe that there is some targeting going on, especially our students. So Patrice, thank you again. And Wendy, make some comments here in closing about Indian Heritage Month. You have before you on the screen, November the 20th and 21st here in Raleigh, a virtual celebration. This is the 25th Indian Heritage Month celebration in our state. It has grown from an Indian Heritage Day over the years, an Indian Heritage Week, and now it's an Indian Heritage Month. On the 20th is targeted for Indian education, Patrice. That's the day for the schools, targeting students. Everything being promoted and seeing that is going to be directed to our students. You know, on a typical day on the 20th, we would have hands-on exercises they could be involved in. They could be making some American Indian arts and crafts out there working with our artists. But this time around, it's just going to be demonstrations virtually. On the 21st, though, is more of the exhibition and presentation day. So this year, all of that would take place virtually in North Carolina. So we're going to continue that process. We're so glad that we have support from our state government, Health and Human Services, for COVID-19, as well as support through cultural resources for our Indian Heritage Month celebration. So you had that map earlier, Wendy. I wanted to kind of showcase that in closing. That gives you a snapshot or a portrait of North Carolina. You saw the national map earlier, so I wanted to kind of showcase that map. That is on our website, and it shows the location for all of our tribes, state and federally recognized in the state of North Carolina, where they might be geographically located. So if you're an EE officer for OSHR working, say, Bladen and Columbus County area, you can see that the Waccamaw Siouan are in that region. Or if you're working the northeastern part of the state with Meherrin up in Hertford and Hertford County out in that part of the states where Meherrin are. In my home county, the blue area, that's not, that blue was not put in there because of the election. It was blue before the election. So I just wanted to mention that. But it did go blue. Anyway, Halifax and Warren County, Hiawassee. And you'll see from that snapshot there where the majority of our Indian people live in the state. And the good Lord, we believe, put us there. That particular area, if you can imagine, the Interstate 95 corridor coming in from Halifax County and exiting North Carolina, down in the red in Robertson County, then most of our tribal members, our population exists along that I-95 corridor. Of course, we were there before I-95, so go figure. You know, that's our homeland. We've been there. We are not removed. We own our own property, fee simple, own our own farms. Eastern Band on the western part of the state, up in Swain, Jackson, Graham, in that area, would be the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And so that's kind of a quick little portrait of where we are in the state. And so if we can ever assist you here at the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, Wendy, you know where to find me. We are right down the hall.
Yes, I definitely know where to find you, Greg. And I would like to add that on behalf of Director Gibson with the Office of State Human Resources and Nancy A. Strike, our Division Director of Diversity Services, I would like to again thank you and Patrice for participating in our event today. And again, anyone that's out there that's a recruiter or just in general that's interested in recruiting American Indians for positions that are open in their agencies and universities, please look into recruiting people that are of American Indian background or heritage, because they are there's a great well of talent there. So please look into recruiting individuals who are American Indian. To all of our speakers and to everyone that participated today and for the questions that we had, it was all very informative. And I just look forward to hearing from Indian Affairs, and of course, OSHR continuing to work with you in the future. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to send either me a message or Gina Streety. And this video will be placed on our website if you would like to view it later. Again, thank you. And we will have events coming up in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.